Welcome back to the show today, folks. Our guest today is Dr. John Byron. We're continuing our series, A Week in the Life of, and John has done an excellent job. He has written the book for A Week in the Life of a Slave. So I know many of you have watched and read and bought the books of A Week in the Life of Ephesus and A Week in the Life of Corinth, or A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman Woman. I want to encourage you. We'll put this in the show notes for John's book as well. So, John, thanks for your time today, brother.
Thank you. Appreciate being here and this opportunity to talk about my book, a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, you've done some other writing outside of this as well.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work on slavery. Also done a bit of work in First and Second Thessalonians, and also on the reception history of Cain and Abel, the Cain and Abel story. So that was just kind of a rabbit hole I went down for about a decade. So yeah,
Yeah, we'll have to discuss that sometime, maybe in the future.
that'd be
How did
great.
you get involved with this series, A Week in the Life series?
Um, It's interesting. I was in 2012. My wife and I were in Turkey, and we were there touring around, the ancient sites of Asia Minor. And I was in the marketplace and the theater there in Ephesus, where all the events take place in the life of Paul. And I got inspired to start writing a fictional account, like I did here. I was actually very attracted to this style of presentation. Bruce Longenecker had done a book called Lost Letters of Pergamum, which is also historical fiction, and Gert Tyson had done one on the historical Jesus. I forget the exact name. But basically it was The Search for the Galilean. And I had used those for my students over the years, and I had thought, well, what would be great if I did this. So I actually wrote up a chapter starting with Ephesus. It actually ended up, I think, being chapter 2 or 3 in the book. And then it just didn't go anywhere. And then David De Silva, who's also in the series and my colleague here at the seminary, he was reviewing some pages from Ben Witherington's book, A Week in the Life of Corinth, the first one in the series. And David had known that I had done this, and he said, I think this might be a good place for you to consider placing it. So I contacted Dan Reed at IVP. He was there at the time, and yeah, took off. And then from there, I just continued to, add to what I had already started with. So that's how I got into the series.
Well, that's interesting that David would uh, remember that and include that. So, yeah, praise God. That's it. So you've got this book. It's set in first century in the city of Ephesus. Paul is in prison there.
Right.
So what was the significance of choosing Ephesus, and maybe what we know from Acts that Paul spent a considerable amount of time there.
Right.
And what was the role that Ephesus played in the development of Christianity and so forth in the geographical region?
All right. Well, yeah. Well, those are a lot of questions in one, but I'll
Yeah, it
do
is.
my
It
best.
is.
But they all do feed into it. The reason why I chose Ephesus, a lot of it has to do with the fact that although Rome is the only imprisonment that we're actually aware of Paul, I mean, we know that he was imprisoned in Caesarea Maritima for a while, but Rome is the one that gets everybody's attention because obviously that's the way the book of Acts ends. It seems as if though that's where Paul is when he's writing his letter to the Philippians. But the more I study Philemon and I study the ancient world, I was having a real difficult time seeing all the back and forth that's going on between Philemon and Paul and Onesimus being Philemon being what we believe is in Colossae in that area. And Paul, if he's in Rome, how does a runaway slave travel 1,200 miles? Meet somehow an imprisoned apostle there, and then is able to travel back, and all of this without being caught. So that has always just seemed a hurdle to me. There are some traditions around the Apostle Paul being imprisoned in Ephesus. They are not biblical, but there are some traditions. I believe there's even a traditional prison of Paul in Ephesus. Nothing archaeologically connects it to it. But for me as well, again, thinking also about the distance, having Onesimus having to travel as he flees Philemon from Colossae to Ephesus, which is really maybe about 120, maybe 150 miles, that just seems far more doable to me than it does making it to Rome. So yeah, I chose it. I acknowledge in the book, the story doesn't depend on it, but it's where I decided to do the setting. And as you note, Ephesus just plays a huge part in early Christianity. Um, it is, of course, not only where the Church of Ephesus is located, John later when he's writing Revelation there, and then of course, we know that later apostles were there in Ephesus, and including, there's a tradition that Mary, the mother of Jesus, moved there, and there's a house you can visit, and whether it is or not, and there's a cave there with a drawing of Paul and Thecla from the apocryphal Acts of Paul. So there's just a lot about Ephesus that shows us the importance of it for Christianity. And also that we know later on there is a tradition that there was a bishop named Onesimus in Ephesus in the 2nd century, which just provides a really interesting connection for our story. So all of those elements just played into my decision to locate it in Ephesus, acknowledging fully it might not be, but it works well for the story. And again, the book is intended to teach history, and so that's why I did it that way. So,
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about the prison system in this time. We see Paul in prison in the opening part, and he's being visited and introduced to Onesimus, quite to his shock.
Yeah. So prisons, there's been a lot of work being done even more recently since I wrote the book on the archaeology of prisons. Prisons were not the way that we imagined them today, where, there are these industrial block places where people are kept long term and they get fed meals and maybe, work in a shop. I'm thinking here about scenes from Shawshank Redemption, which incidentally was filmed here in Ashland, and the prison where it was filmed is only 7 miles from where I'm sitting right now. So I've been there numerous times. That's just a very modern concept. In antiquity, and as I tried to demonstrate in the book, prisons were often dark places. They may not even been so-called purpose-built as prisons. They may have been dungeons, or lack of a better term, a basement in a building. And you weren't really actually sentenced typically to 5 or 10 years in a cell and doing things like that. They were a holding place until you had a trial, or until something else that was related to your punishment was going to happen. But often then after that, your punishment was execution, working in a quarry, working in the galleys of the ship. It wasn't a place where you stayed typically. And also the other thing is, it wasn't a place where, they were providing you meals. If you were going to survive, somebody had to be bringing you food to do that. So now I'm reading another book at the moment, God's Ghostwriters by Candida Moss. And she's talking about the role that slaves may have played in copying New Testament texts. And her presentation of prisons, which I don't disagree with, it's a little bit more darker, literally, than what I gave in the book. But she does make an important point. Often, prisons were a place in the basement of a building, and you were lucky to have a little light that was looking out onto the street, where supporters, meaning friends or family, might be able to pass you food. if you were able to get it and not have to fight with fellow prisoners over it. But it was also a place where people might hurl abuses at you, or even including relieving themselves through the window into your area. So I use all those descriptions. Prison it's not a nice place now. It was even worse 2,000 years ago. So,
And we see Onesimus, who is the runaway slave. Maybe talk to us a little bit about, I know how uncomfortable he was being in the prison, wondering, what are you guys doing to me? I
yeah.
want to get out of here, but maybe talk about slaves in the first century and, the different types of slaves and maybe what purpose they would have served.
Right. Well, I think you bring up a good point. There are a variety of different types of people that were enslaved. And, again, when we think about slavery here in the New World, there are a lot of similarities, including even the laws that enforced slavery in North America. You read Roman laws on slaves, there's a lot of parallels. But of course, the difference is slavery in the ancient world was not based on racial. Look, here obviously the African slave trade was what supported it. In antiquity, in theory, anybody could become a slave just for about any reason. Commit a crime, fail to pay taxes, do something, and you could end up becoming a slave. And then if you were a slave, one way that particularly that a lot of people in the first century were becoming slaves was no longer as prisoners of war. It had been the case when Augustus was, if you will, bringing peace to the empire. But a lot of times you were a slave because you were born a slave. To be quite frank about it, in-house breeding, and the law recognized that whatever the status of your mother was is what your status was. So it was not uncommon for masters and other freeborn owners of other freeborn people to sexually take advantage and to use slaves, and then offspring that were produced from those encounters were not freeborn; they were slaves. So it wouldn't have been unusual for a master of a home to have slaves that were his own children as well. So yeah, and then again, even as the case here in the New World with slavery, there are a variety of jobs and types of slavery. The vast majority of people that were enslaved probably were those that were working in agriculture, quarries, dock work, the kind of people whose life was pretty unpleasant and also rather short based on the work. But you could also be somebody that worked in a home, taking care of a home. I try to portray some people like that. And some slaves were actually very well educated. They were doctors. They had the ability to read and write and serve as teachers. I do want to comment though on that last part, because there's been at times there's been a perspective that has been out there where people have tried to demonstrate how wonderful Roman slavery was. I understand what they're doing. They're trying, of course, to reconcile what we have in the scriptures with the experience here in the New World. But keep in mind, you were still just a slave. Your life was not your own, even if you were educated. And you were educated. You could read and write, but you were owned by somebody. And your life at any time, for any reason, you could be sold, punished, used sexually. So it was not a good life. Slavery was never a good idea. So,
yeah. And we see the prison, the manager, I guess his name is it Tyro?
Tiro, I couldn't, but yeah, he's
Tiro.
yeah.
Now he was a former slave. Maybe explain to us how he became the manager of the prison, the process that if someone was fortunate enough to have
So there were, in addition to slaves that were owned by individuals, there also were those that we would call public slaves. And Tiro is somebody that I fashioned as a public slave. You know, the Romans, of course, had huge public works. You know, if you're going to keep an empire and keep it happy, you need to be able to feed people. You also need to be able to provide them with clean drinking water and sanitation. And in order to do that, there were literally public slaves, slaves that were owned by the local municipality, and they were used by the government to take care of these things. And you know, you did have the ability at times to become free. There are a variety of ways that could happen. When you reach the age of 30, Augustus had put a law into place that that was the age at which you could be freed. Again, let me just say, we often hear that, we go, wow, what, you know, you only had to work to 30 and then you could move on with your life. Well, yeah, but when the average life expectancy was 30, you know, your body might have been pretty beat up by then, and you're used to having your food and water and housing taken care of you. Now you're free, which means, how am I going to take care of this stuff?
You got to
It
get
was
out and hustle now.
Well, yeah, and then of course, then there is still a stigma, as we see elsewhere in the ancient world. There's still a stigma with being a former slave. You know, not everybody made, you know, that transition as well. You know, you may become a slave because your master released you in his will. And so when he died, you know, you became freed. This happened at times for a variety of reasons. And you also could earn a little bit of money. It was not unusual for slaves to be, they're allowed to be working on the side or doing some things entrepreneurially on their own. And they would be earning money and they could keep a portion of that money, if you will, sort of like a weekly or monthly allowance called the peculium. And it ultimately really belonged to the master, but you could buy your freedom if you were able to save up enough over the years. So yeah, there's a variety of ways that you could become free, Ken. And in the book, you know, I'm showing how Tiro has done that. He's become moved out of a public slave. I'm going to admit, I can't remember how I got him out of slavery. I just remember that he was. Maybe I should have reread that chapter last night. But he does become free. But also that connection that he already had with the magistrates locally is what enabled him to be able to become the manager of the prison. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe talk to us maybe a little bit about of the religion in this area. I know what it says, one of the seven wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis.
Yeah. So, yeah, the Temple of Artemis, it was, as you said, it was one of the seven wonders of the world. It was you know, the goddess Artemis, that which had existed before the Romans were there. And you know, it had become in many ways, there were many worship temples in the ancient world. Ephesus as well had a temple to Asclepius. They had temples to the various Roman emperors, and also, though, the one that everybody was really attracted to, it was a place of religious tourism, was this Temple of Artemis that people would come to. And so this, if you will, when Paul came to this city, we have to keep in mind that he really was competing in the marketplace of religious ideas. And from the book of Acts, we have this story about how he gets into some difficulties with Demetrius and the silversmiths. They make these little silver trinkets or something, if you will, souvenirs for people to take home. To the best of my knowledge, archaeology has never discovered any of these things, but the idea still reflects religious tourism was a common thing. If you had the money and you were going someplace, you wanted to go and see this. And even here, I would say, keep in mind the temples themselves might also have slaves that related and were working in there. So for Paul to come in and begin preaching this new idea, wasn't completely new, obviously, because it was birthed out of Judaism, but still to come in, he had an uphill battle, I would say. And then, of course, as we have from the book of Acts, any success that he had just didn't go over too well with the local population. And so that's kind of the landscape that you have there. Just different religions, different people, and it would have been a common part of that world. David does a really good book in A Week in the Life of Ephesus of setting the stage of what it would have been like to be in Ephesus at that time, and just the various religious groups that existed. So,
What about talk to about a little bit maybe about the geography? I know there were some things that you mentioned in there. This particular area was hit by earthquakes, and how that would have affected maybe people's religious beliefs or security about life or structures.
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the Lycus Valley, where three of our cities that we look at in the book and as well as in the New Testament, you got Laodicea, you got Hierapolis, and then you got Colossae. And these three cities are susceptible to earthquakes. There's a rift line that runs right through that area. And at various times, it's more active than others. We know, for instance, that around 60 AD, a major earthquake struck that area. And it was at that time that it completely destroyed Colossae. And Colossae has sat in ruins literally until just the last decade. Archaeologists have only in the last 5 to 10 years began excavating there. But Laodicea, interesting enough, was able to rebuild. They did it without any help, from the Roman imperial treasury. So you think then later on to John's comments in to the letter to the Church of Laodicea. You say we're rich, well, we don't need anything. Yeah. Laodicea was a wealthy area, and then as was Hierapolis, very well known for their wool dyeing production that took place there. I'm not familiar with anything religiously that would have impacted them in their thinking as far as earthquakes go. But the fact of the matter is, earthquakes were a major threat to life, still as they still are today, and also economics. And so when I have in the beginning of that book, at the beginning of that one chapter where there's an earthquake coming as the character is waking up, I'm trying to communicate to the reader, particularly as I'm trying to teach my students about the New Testament. Don't just simply read the letters of Paul with the theology. Get into the world. What was life like for them living there? In addition to all the hardships you're facing, you got the ongoing challenge of the earth moving under your feet. Which, of course, in those days, there were no earthquake-proof buildings. Not that we really have any proof buildings, but we've learned to construct buildings a lot more that can react to earthquakes better. In the ancient world, everything's stone and brick, so you can imagine the mess that would have created.
Maybe talk to us a little bit about the social structure of the classes of people in society. I know that was kind of a shock to Onesimus when he first attended a service, a Christian house service, worship service in someone's home, and he began to see interaction that it was like, whoa, what, this is not right. This is,
right.
Hey, we're off the chain here. Something's really going on. Are they really doing this?
No, yeah, and I did that purposefully. In the ancient world, and again, David does a really good job of this, particularly in his book on Ephesus, as he does in all his work. This is his area of expertise, even more than mine. But we know that in the ancient world, social stratus, even as it still exists today, much despite the fact we tried to deny that, you had You had those that were rich, you had those who were poor, those that were Roman citizens, you had your influencers, you had slave, you had free business owners. And then, of course, even there, you talk about the religious mix, you had Jews and others, coming in. And it was very much the practice that we see, even in the Gospels and in the New Testament, we hear echoes of this. One tended to hang out with one's own social status or class.
We're
Again,
not much different, are we?
I was gonna say, again, we do this today. Yeah, most churches that we attend look like one. Everybody looks similar socioeconomic status. It's not unusual. Jesus, of course, as well as even Paul, they challenge these ideas. Particularly that when you're coming together, that you have slaves and everybody there. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for instance, Paul, he's talking to Jews, and then he talks to slaves. Were you born a slave? Don't worry about it. If you're born free, don't be trying to become a slave. What's interesting there is if we don't watch it, means Paul's addressing a slave sitting right there as part of the, if you will, the audience hearing his letter being read. And that kind of clued me in, as well as, reading things about, Jesus's parables. When you get invited to a banquet, don't sit at the top of the table, but, choose the lower place. Christianity challenged these ideas. But at the same time, I think sometimes we read with, if you will, stained glass windows, even in the Bible, and we assume that everybody just automatically adopted this idea that, oh, you're right. What have we been doing all our lives? Okay, everybody's equal. And I just don't, I just not sure that I can support that. It's not that I see a lot going on in the New Testament, but what we know about society and just human nature, it takes time for people to adjust. So what I did there, what I tried to set up purposefully, was two different examples of what church life would have been like. You've got the church that is meeting in Philemon's home. Him and Aphia are the hosts there, and that church operates very much according to the established social structures of what we would expect in the ancient world. And I've even got that one scene where the leader, Archivist, gets up and he moves somebody into the place of honor in that area. And of course, the other slaves are watching this. And then, but in Ephesus, where Paul is, and it's got a lot more influence because he had, at this point, as far as we know, he never visited Colossae. His letter was just written at the request probably of Epaphras. But in Ephesus, I tried to show a different presentation of what it would have been like to actually see that the ideal, I would say, of what the New Testament tries to tell us about, coming together, that all are equal, that all participate. And yeah, I wanted Onesimus I wanted to see things through his eyes rather than that of the enslavers that are over him. So
I think the one scene you have as you're wrapping up one of the chapters, if I remember it correctly, was I think he's laying down, he's contemplating what he has experienced, and he says, is it possible for a master and a slave to be brothers in this, religion, this faith? And
right.
He's just overwhelmed with what he's witnessed. So apparently, to your point, it probably wasn't going on everywhere, because he would have seen that in Philemon's home church.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I took my clue for those kinds of things that I did about the fact that it was different in Philemon's home, the fact that Onesimus was not sure, based on what Paul says in the letter. I mean, when Paul meets Onesimus, he is a, quote, unconverted individual, and apparently Philemon is not treating him as a brother.
And let me interrupt you. So
Yeah.
with you talk about household conversions, and I think that kind of proves your point a little bit more there,
Right.
that if, you're the head of the household, John, then everybody's going to follow, you know, your faith, your religion.
Exactly. Yeah, we see a number of examples of this in the New Testament. It's not something that we today, with our Western individualism, would adopt. But in antiquity, I mean, Lydia and her whole household was baptized. You don't get the impression that everybody was given a choice. The Cornelius, the Roman centurion, him and his house. Uh, you know, so if the master of the home decided to become a Christian and get baptized, everybody lined up. We're getting baptized. Um, yeah, and again, we don't know. In the book, I have Onesimus not having been baptized, so I have that scene where Paul does the baptism, but we don't really know what the situation was in Philemon's house. But Paul seems to be, the thing that he's addressing the most in that letter is Philemon needs to treat Onesimus differently, welcome him back, and treat him as a brother. Perhaps something he hadn't been doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure when he got that letter from Paul, which had to be, if you just studied it from a psychological point of view or
Yeah.
persuasive, I bet that was a shock to his system when he read it. He probably read it and carried
Yeah.
it to his wife and said, John, can you believe what Paul's asking me to do? This man, he's lost his mind here. It was quite a stretch.
It was, but at the same time, to your point, the little example that you used here, I just want to point out the letter, and the way I presented the book. I'm not so sure that Philemon even had the chance to read it privately, because the letter is addressed to Philemon and the church that meets in your house. So this my presentation and how I understand the letters. This was probably a public reading of this letter, and Philemon's hearing it for the first time, and Paul's really painting him into a corner. Uh, it's funny, Ken, when I was working on the book, I had some other sections of the book that are no longer there, and I'd have to pull them out to remind myself exactly what I said. But I had Tychicus, shall we say, being a bit more forceful in the way he was painting Philemon into a corner. And the editor at IVP, we had this back and forth, and he got a little provoked at me at one time, and I understand it. He goes, "You're making Paul sound manipulative," and I wanted to write back. I said, "Have you read Paul?" Yeah, no, he is. Paul is definitely, but he does it skillfully with just a gifted rhetoric to do this that I don't possess. So, yeah.
And the public reading like that, it really, within this culture, maybe you speak to kind of the honor and shame and patron client type deal. It would have really put pressure on Philemon to, just, whatever you want, Paul.
Right.
Everybody's watching me now. This is not done in secret. You and I are sitting here visiting.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and particularly too, as I'm reading Candida Moss's book right now, I'm reminded again how much of letter writing was meant for a public reading, even a performance of that. Because again, only 5 to 10% of the population could read. And again, if you were a reader, you were also trained to read. And so you think about that situation of, Onesimus and Tychicus, in my view, showing up to the church there, and Philemon sees this, finds out he's been with Paul. I mean, can you think about blow Philemon's mind? Where have you been? Oh, I've been with Paul. You what? You've been where? And then he reads this letter, and as you said, the honor and shame elements that Paul is bringing to bear in that letter is really important. I'm going to open up my Bible here as I talk about this with you. Because, Paul starts out there, and this doesn't really get into the book, but it gets into some other things I published in articles. Paul starts out and he praises Philemon for, oh, these things that you've done, and you're so well known, and you've refreshed the hearts of the saints. And Paul uses this word, a Greek word in verse 7 there for heart, that we translate heart. It's not cardia. It's not the typical Greek word we would expect. It's this word splankna, which really has this emotive sense to it. I mean, you also can hear Paul's emotions here, but he's saying, you are gosh, people benefit from you, probably maybe financially or some kind of patronage that maybe Philemon offered others. Oh, you're so well known. And then later on, when he introduces Onesimus to the equation, he then says to Philemon in verse 12, he goes, I'm sending him back to you. That is my very heart. And that word that he uses there again, that word is splankna again, not cardia. So Paul is basically saying, you're well known for refreshing the hearts of the saints. Well, here's my heart. My heart is Onesimus. And then later on, Paul he then says to him at the end, in verse 20, he says, yes, brother, or yea, brother, I beseech you in the Lord, refresh my heart in Christ. And that last verse 20, Paul is literally turning the vocabulary that he showed in verse 7, like, you refresh the hearts of the saints. He's now saying, well, do this for me. Well, what's Paul's heart in this letter? It's Onesimus. So what he's really saying, without saying it, is do for Onesimus that which you're so well known for doing for the saints, as well as saying to him, treat him as a brother. And to your point, Ken, you imagine all of this taking place in a public reading. Maybe there's 15, 20, 40 people in the room. And what are you going to do? Your honor. And Paul, of course, is somebody who's got more honor than you, if you will. He's respected. You want to do what is, of course, best for everybody, particularly for yourself. And then, of course, as we always like to joke, Paul throws that little tagline at the end. Oh, and by the way, have a guest room for me, just in case I decide to show up and check up on you. So
masterful. You got to love that.
It is. I mean, for a short letter of 300 and some odd words, he packs it in there. Yeah.
But he really gives a Philemon an opportunity to really receive greater honor.
Exactly.
By taking this path that he is strongly suggesting.
Right. Yeah. And by doing that, everybody gets something out of the deal, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. Everybody can win.
Exactly. And I don't really see that. I don't see that as a transactional relationship. I mean, yes, it certainly is to a point, but I also think I see Paul. Paul is a master at using the culture and the social setting to reach the ends that he desires when it comes to the message of the gospel, and what Jesus means for everybody, what that means for them as a human being and their social status. So.
Yeah, and you can imagine all of the people that were in Philemon's house listening to this and watching his reaction, just how powerful that would have been for them to hear.
Mm-hmm.
We probably, don't have quite the understanding of the culture and the things that are going on, but they would have been going, wow, this is transformative. This is turning the world upside down, turning the social structure upside down. I mean, he could throw this guy in prison,
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot legally that Philemon could have brought to bear on the situation, and could have punished Onesimus right there, and would have been within his rights, and nobody would have stopped him.
Well, let's talk about one of the characters here, Demas.
Ah,
Uh, Paul mentions him, and he's my co-worker. You know, welcome Demas.
right.
And then we see how I believe he headed out to having loved this present world. I think it's 2 Timothy 4:10 that Demas has forsaken me and went to Thessalonica, I believe it was. And
Yep.
um, maybe what can we learn from that relationship? And
Well, I think what I wanted to show there again is, again, keep in mind that I wrote the book with my students in mind, and we tend to read the Bible with very rose-colored glasses. And we think, oh, how wonderful it is. And there's a lot of pain underneath the surface. A lot of the human situation is very obvious. And again, just as sometimes people just assume, well, everybody must have just accepted everything about the gospel. Not everybody continued on with it. Demas is a person who, for whatever reason, and Paul just simply, he loved this world more. He decided, nope, I'm not doing this. I'm going back. Um, it's interesting. We want to imagine that everybody that came to Christ in the ancient world just went on, and I'm trying to show, just using just little hints that we have, because that's all we have in the New Testament. These are throwaway lines, and then I'm developing a story or the character from it. But they provide us a view that becoming a Christian in the ancient world was not easy, and not everybody was successful in continuing with it. Some of them said, nope, I'm not going to do this. I tried to demonstrate that with the other house church that's meeting in Laodicea, and that church was there because there had been somebody else who had been hosting the church, and probably was doing it because he thought he was going to be able to gather more clients to himself. But then once it became socially unacceptable, he just stepped out. I actually got the idea from Bruce Longenecker's Lost Letters of Pergamum. He has a character like that as well. So I adopted that from Bruce's book as well. So
yeah, it's we think, boy, if I would have been around the Apostle Paul in Ephesus, he's touching clothing, cloths, and they're sending it. People are getting healed, and I'm sitting here observing right here. John, the demons are coming out of people, and they're
right.
burning scrolls and
Magic books,
on
yeah.
and on and on. And you could say the same thing about Christ. How could you not follow him? We might think, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here looking, and John is blind, and wow,
Yeah,
you
miracles,
see
yeah.
one after another. Yeah, it really speaks to that, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. I mean, again, those are all wonderful things, but not everybody followed through. Not everybody does follow. And one of the things I love about the scripture so much, Ken, is and again, when I talk to my students about this, is scriptures, the characters and scriptures we have, they are there, warts and all. Uh, I joke with my students about when we read through Galatians, and Paul, he probably says some things he wished he hadn't later. He says, I wish you would all just, you're so into circumcision. I wish you'd go the whole way and emasculate yourselves. I'm like, okay. I always tell my students, I said, try that at your next board of elders meeting. Let me know how that goes. This is not a leadership technique that we recommend. Um, but it's good because for me, that's a source of encouragement. I can see somebody who, I've got great respect for Paul and the work that he did, but he went through some of the same struggles I did. He lost his temper. Could probably be a bit of a jerk at times, the way he treated others. He was so focused on what he was doing. I find that encouraging for me, that, I'm not missing a mark, if you will. I'm just like everyone. The church didn't come out of Pentecost perfect. I tell my students there's no such thing as a golden age of the church. It never existed. Uh, I get students, they come, I'm like, so tell me about yourself. What is it you want to do? And they go, oh, Dr. Byron, I want to start a New Testament church. I said, a New Testament church? They said, yes. I said, so which one are you going to do? The one in Corinth where the worship services sound like a circus and, you know, one of the people is sleeping with his stepmother, or what about the one in Galatians where they're gonna sign up for circumcision and maybe enforce food laws, or Thessalonica where we're not gonna work, we're gonna wait for Jesus to return. Which New Testament church do you want to be? And I know that comes across as sharp and sarcastic with them, but it's a teaching moment. We didn't mess up the church. The church has been messed up from day one, and God knows it. God is still working through the church, and that's good news for us. God works through human beings with all the mess that comes with it. So, yeah,
Yeah, God can deliver His word through folks like you and me.
exactly, and does, much to my chagrin sometimes. So,
Well, I really like that in I think it's the first chapter, Paul, of course, he's in prison. He's got all these concerns already. Am I going to be executed or whatever? I got the churches are a burden to me. Got my papyrus over here. I need to rip off another letter to somebody, straighten them out. And then, his reaction, I really love that because, I had never thought that that's how he would respond. I just thought, again, you talk about, how we read it through, Western eyes, and
right.
the Paul's like upset, like, golly, man, what the heck are you doing here, John? You bringing me a prisoner? Don't you know my
Right.
plate's full, brother? Y'all walk out of here right now.
Well, and you can pick up even these things even in Paul's letter. He talks about how he got provoked with Peter and with Barnabas in the Antioch incident. His in Acts, the presentation we have of him there is he's pretty provoked at John Mark for not coming back, and then him and Barnabas end up separating over this, and to the best of our knowledge, don't reconcile. We just don't know. Um, those are important things for us to recognize that, Paul had bad days just like everybody else. He was human. So, yeah. Those were what were in my mind when I was doing this. It's fun, Ken, when you think about, you're writing a book, and I'm glad I didn't write this particular book until I did. I'm glad I didn't do it earlier in my career because I had I've been working on and thinking about Philemon and slavery literally since I was a teenager. I mean, I've been attracted to Philemon since a teenager, but to sit down then and take with me 25, 30 years of studying and teaching on this, and then to put it into fiction, but historical fiction, it was a real fun exercise where, okay, how are you going to create these characters, knowing that you're using your imagination, but you're also using history, and then I was forced to go out and have to learn new things. I had to go out and learn all about wool dyeing, the stuff I didn't know, in order to introduce that to, introduce that as to an element in the book. So,
Yeah, well, you definitely did. It's a solid historical book from all the research that you've done, but it's a fun read.
thank you.
You don't have to sit there and be studying for your PhD or MDiv or whatever. Someone is sitting in the pew can read this, and I think it really broaden their understanding of, the letters that Paul wrote and the New Testament background.
Yeah, we've actually done it as my pastor chose it as a book that we did for one of our Bible studies. So that was fun to be able for me to sit down with a group of people who read the book and talk together about the ideas that are there. So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, great book here, folks. A Week in the Life of a Slave. Well, John, if someone wanted to take a class, do you do online classes through Ashland, or is it all in person? I know David does, I think his is all online now.
A majority of what we do now is online. In fact, two of the courses I'm teaching in the fall, I'm teaching Greek online. Although when I say online, I generally have a quote in-person session like this. So when I teach Greek this year, we'll be meeting every Monday night for an hour, maybe an hour and a half to go over what they learned and as well as do some readings. And I'm also going to be teaching a course on New Testament backgrounds this fall. If people would be interested in doing that, if you are interested in the history, the culture, and even the archaeology of the first century, your listeners may be interested in that. They could, even if they're not a student at Ashland, they have the ability to sign up as an auditor. I think they could do it for like $300, and that would be they would be taking, doing some things on their own, watching some videos, and then we'll be actually getting together here. So to do that. So, once a week we'll be getting online, and I'm looking to bring in some guest speakers. Graham Twelftree, who's a colleague and friend of mine, whose area expertise is magic in the ancient world. Graham and I have been in conversation this last week, in fact, and he's going to probably come in for an hour one week and talk about spells and the use of magic in the ancient world. And when we think about how people would have perceived Paul and even Jesus in that context. So yeah, just doing things that way.
Well, that's great. Yeah, some of the best courses I've taken. I just finished a master's of theology at Southwestern in Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And this past month, I just did it for fun, just taking courses. But yeah, it's I may have to look into that myself. But if people wanted to contact you, John, how would they reach out to you? Just through your email or?
Yeah, so just simply jbyron@ashland.edu. I'd be happy to hear from people. And Ken, if I could be so bold, if there are people out there who would like to engage me, or perhaps even have me come do some speaking, I'm willing to do that virtually as well. I could do it locally, but I'm in Ohio, so it might be a little difficult for me to get to Texas. But I offer a variety of lectures on how we got the Bible, the New Testament and textual criticism, archaeology, fakes and forgery. I got a variety of things, and I'd be willing to engage with anybody and their church or classes via Zoom or Teams or whatever video platform they want to use. So
Yeah, technology is awesome.
it is, we were heading this way before COVID. Obviously, as everybody knows, COVID accelerated it. There's good things and bad things, but I'm enjoying it. I'm adjusting to it, and it's a great way to engage people you never could before. So
Absolutely. Well, I certainly appreciate your time today. It's man, you really enriched my life talking to me and your book. I love your book. Like I said, we'll put it in the show notes, and thank you.
thank you, and thanks for contacting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about it. So.